Britain has been here before, 5 times already this year actually. But something shifted in the last few weeks that turns this from a familiar summer story into something genuinely different. It's not just that the temperature climbed again, it's that an entire country's relationship with water just changed quietly underneath the headlines about sunshine and record highs. 23 million people are now living under water restrictions. Wales just recorded its driest July in 190 years. And for the first time this summer, the word being used isn't heatwave, it's drought. So what actually changed? Why did a 6th heat wave push this crisis somewhere the first 5 didn't? And why are officials now treating this as something bigger than just another hot spell? A summer that kept breaking its own record. So to understand what's different now, you need the full run-up, because this year hasn't behaved like a normal British summer even once. The first heat wave hit in May, delivering a record 35-point wonder seat at Kew Gardens, the hottest May day the UK has ever recorded. The second arrived in late June, and it didn't just break a record, it obliterated one, hitting 37.7 degrees at Lingwood in Norfolk, a new UK record, alongside a Wales record of 35.9 degrees at Bute Park in Cardiff, with a rare Met Office red extreme heat warning in force for 3 consecutive days, something that had literally never happened before in the history of that warning system. The third heat wave peaked in early July at 35.5 Fares at Wisley in Surrey. The fourth began July 28th, pushing highs to 35 degrees across the southeast under a UKHSA amber alert. By early August, 2026 had already become the first year on record with UK temperatures of 35 degrees Celsius, or higher recorded in 3 separate months. Britain doesn't typically produce weather extreme enough to make that kind of superlative possible even once in a generation, let alone in a single summer, and the fact that it happened across May, June, and July alone should tell you something about how unusual this year has genuinely been before the drought crisis even entered the picture. Then came the 5th heat wave on August 2nd, and a 6th, slightly longer one beginning August 9th, pushing the Met Office's tally of days in 2026 with temperatures above 30 degrees somewhere in the country to 33, one single. Day short of the entire national record of 34 days, set all the way back in 1995. On the 9th of August alone, temperatures reached 30.6 degrees at Frittenden in Kent, with regional highs peaking between 31 and 32 degrees across London and the southeast, even as persistent cloud and heavy rain simultaneously dumped more than 100 millimeters, roughly half a month's average. Rainfall across northwest Scotland in a single 48-hour stretch. A stark reminder that this crisis has never been uniform across the whole country at once, where the real change actually happened. Here's the detail that separates this from simply being another hot summer. And it's not really about the thermometer at all. By late July, southern England had received just 1% of its expected monthly rainfall, not a modest shortfall, 1%. Combined with their relentless string of heat waves baking the ground dry between rounds, that combination developed into what officials describe as a flash drought, a drought that builds unusually fast rather than developing gradually over a full season, precisely because record-low rainfall and exceptionally high temperatures compounded on top of each other simultaneously rather than one problem following the other with time to adjust in between. The Environment Agency responded by moving 7 of its 14 operational areas into official drought status. Wales followed on July 30th, with the entire country placed under drought declaration, after recording its driest July in 190 years, records stretching back through nearly 2 centuries of continuous measurement. This wasn't a regional inconvenience. It was a nationwide shift in how officials were forced to classify what was happening to the water supply underneath an entire country. That drought declaration triggered something with direct, immediate consequences for ordinary people. Roughly 23 million customers now fall under enhanced water resource monitoring and water use restrictions, alongside early agricultural crop harvests forced by the conditions rather than chosen by farmers on their own schedule. When heat stops being just uncomfortable, it's worth understanding exactly what changes once a heat wave crosses from unpleasant into genuinely dangerous territory, because the UK's health warning system is built specifically around that distinction. The UK Health Security Agency issues heat health alerts on a tiered scale, yellow for lower level risk, escalating to amber when the agency warns that significant impacts are likely across health and social care services, including what officials describe plainly as a likely rise in deaths, particularly among people over 65 or with existing health conditions, alongside a likely increase in demand for health services and the risk that internal temperatures in hospitals and care homes could exceed safe clinical thresholds. During the peak of this summer's alerts, amber warnings blanketed every region of England simultaneously, something that hadn't happened with this kind of breadth and repetition across a single summer before. The mechanism behind that danger isn't just the daytime heat. Tropical nights, when overnight temperatures never drop below 20 to 30°C, prevent the human body from getting the recovery window it needs between one dangerous day and the next, allowing heat, stress to accumulate across consecutive days rather than resetting each morning. Met Office Chief Forecaster Chris Bulmer explained the pattern behind the sixth heat wave specifically. High pressure becoming dominant, with southerly and southeasterly winds tapping directly into hot conditions already sitting over continental Europe, layering fresh heat on top of a summer that had already run hot and dry for months across the south of the country, even though he noted this particular peak would be more short-lived than some of the earlier rounds. A detail that sounds small until you live it. Some of the most visceral evidence of this shift showed up in places you wouldn't expect a heatwave story to reach. In Crowborough, East Sussex, Rotherfield Primary School had to close for 3 consecutive days because water simply stopped flowing properly from the taps, the head teacher describing only a trickle dribbling through. That's not a dramatic wildfire or a flooded street. It's a primary school unable to open because the water infrastructure underneath an entire region had been pushed past what months of heat and drought conditions had left it able to reliably deliver. That kind of infrastructure strain tends to arrive quietly, without the dramatic visuals of a flood or a fire, which is part of why it's easy to underestimate how serious a slow-building drought crisis actually is until it shows up somewhere as concrete as a classroom tap running dry. The fire risk, hiding underneath the drought, layered directly on top of the water crisis, sits a second related danger that tends to get less attention than the headline temperature numbers, but carries its own serious consequences. The Met Office's Fire Severity Index, which assesses how dangerous a fire could become if one were to start, has been pushed into very high, and in parts of England and Wales, exceptional territory during the peak of this summer's heat. Months of dry conditions turned parks, moorland, and countryside vegetation into exactly the kind of tinder-dry fuel that lets a single spark grow into a genuine wildfire. And fire services have repeatedly urged households to avoid barbecues and open flames specifically because of how easily that fuel could ignite under current conditions. The same underlying dryness responsible for the water restrictions is simultaneously responsible for turning the British countryside into terrain far more dangerous than its usual green, damp reputation would suggest. Why this keeps happening, according to the people watching it closest. It's worth taking seriously why 2026 has produced this specific escalating sequence, rather than treating it as simple bad luck. Climate researchers have been explicit that Britain's heat waves are becoming measurably more frequent, more intense, and longer, lasting as global temperatures continue rising, part of the same broader shift meteorologists have documented across the Northern Hemisphere this year. What makes 2026 specifically unusual isn't just any single heat wave in isolation. Several of this year's individual events, while serious, didn't even reach the most extreme temperatures Britain has recorded historically, temperatures that peaked well below the UK's all-time record of 40.3 degrees set in 2022. What's unusual is the sheer repetition, 6 separate heat waves compounding on top of each other across a single summer, each one adding to cumulative soil dryness and water deficit rather than giving the landscape and the water system meaningful time to recover in between. That repetition connects to something this pattern shares with what's been unfolding across North America this same summer. An atmospheric configuration that keeps locking high-pressure ridges in place for unusually long stretches before finally breaking down, only to rebuild again somewhere nearby rather than clearing out entirely. Whether that's driven primarily by the same broader jet stream reorganization tracked elsewhere this summer, or by more localized European patterns pulling heat up from the continent. Repeatedly, the practical effect on the ground has been functionally identical. A landscape and a water system that never got the recovery window a normal British summer would typically provide, 6 times over in a single season. What this actually costs, beyond the water bill, it's worth pausing on the practical cascading effects of a drought declaration this broad, because water restrictions can sound abstract until you see what it actually touches. Enhanced water. Resource monitoring across 7 Environment Agency operational areas means reservoir and groundwater levels are now being tracked with a level of scrutiny normally reserved for genuine emergencies. Early agricultural crop harvests, forced rather than chosen, mean farmers across the affected regions are pulling produce out of the ground ahead of schedule simply because the soil can no longer sustain crops through their normal growing cycle, a decision with direct knock-on effects for food supply chains and prices later in the year. Widespread water use restrictions affecting 23 million customers touch everything from garden hosepipes to, in some water company areas, restrictions on car washing and filling paddling pools. the kind of everyday summer activity that suddenly becomes a genuine point of tension between individual households and a water system running dangerously close to its limits. None of that is as visually dramatic as a wildfire or a flood. But multiplied across 23 million people and an entire agricultural season, it represents one of the more significant, if quietly unfolding, consequences of this summer's heat. What comes next, according to the forecasters? Here's where the story gets genuinely uncertain, and honest forecasting means saying so directly rather than pretending otherwise. Met Office long-range guidance has described the outlook heading into the rest of August as a trend toward more settled conditions, a greater incidence of dry weather, and high-pressure patterns becoming more dominant, which would increase the likelihood of longer dry spells and warmer conditions developing even more widely across the country. That's not necessarily another dramatic, record-breaking heat wave arriving immediately. It's a description of a pattern that continues favoring exactly the conditions, persistent high pressure and minimal rainfall, that produced the drought crisis in the first place. Separately, meteorologists have posed the deeper structural question directly. After this much heat, can the UK actually make up its rainfall deficit before the drought becomes a genuinely multi-season problem rather than a single, unusually hot summer? That's a meaningfully different question than, will it be hot again next week? And it's the one water companies, farmers, and environmental regulators are actually watching most closely right now. What actually happens next? So here's what genuinely matters going forward beyond any single day's temperature forecast. Watch whether autumn and winter rainfall actually arrives at levels sufficient to meaningfully close this year's rainfall deficit. Since a drought this severe, triggered by a flash sequence of 6 heat waves rather than one prolonged dry season, doesn't necessarily resolve itself just because temperatures eventually cool. Watch how water companies manage restrictions across the 23 million customers currently affected as autumn approaches, since the difference between a temporary summer inconvenience and a genuinely prolonged water crisis often comes down to how quickly reservoir and groundwater levels can actually recover. And watch whether this pattern of repeated, closely spaced heat waves becomes 2026's defining anomaly, or simply this decade's new normal, since researchers studying the broader trend have been clear that the frequency behind this summer, not any single temperature record within it, is the detail that should concern people most. Britain's heatwave summer didn't get worse because the thermometer climbed to some dramatic new peak. It got worse because 6 separate heat events compounded into something the country's water system, agriculture, and infrastructure weren't built to absorb all at once. That's the part of this story that doesn't show up in a single day's forecast. And it's exactly why officials are now measuring this summer not in degrees, but in reservoirs, rainfall deficits, and how many more weeks it takes before the word drought finally starts to lift from a country that, until this year, rarely had to use it at all.